Okay. Let's get started again. Probably won't make it through all of this here, but we can pick it up on Thursday. So now we're going to start the PowerPoint slides for Lecture 8 proper, which is about capitalism and population, and we're going to focus here on Marx. Quick background on Marx. 1818 to 1883. Born and educated in Germany, where he earned a PhD in philosophy. He became a journalist briefly and continued to write for popular audiences for the rest of his life. The passages from Capital that I asked you to read might read like fairly complicated scholarly or academic prose. At the time they were published, they were widely read by the working classes. He went to great lengths to make sure that this argument would be comprehensible to non-scholars. Okay? He was persecuted for much of his early adult life. He had to leave Germany because he was being persecuted for his political views and his writings. He moved to Paris, but then he was persecuted there. He moved to Brussels and found out he was persecuted there as well. And then he finally moved to London, where he spent the rest of his adult life. And he spent much of it, according to legend anyway, sitting in the reading room of the library of the British Museum, studying every possible document he could put his hands on relating to the recent economic history of Europe. And towards the end of his life, he actually started reading whatever he could find about ancient and what we would call perhaps anthropological or primitive societies and their economic systems and organizations as well. The book that you read passages of, Capital Volume 1, came out in 1867. Note the subtitle, A Critique of Political Economy. It is not a critique of capital. It is a critique of the ways in which political economists like Adam Smith, like Thomas Malthus, had understood and described capital. And it is intended to be a description and analysis of how capital works, what it is, how it came into being, and how it operates. Smith and Marx, as I've already said, have a great deal in common. They share the distinction between exchange value and use value that I just described earlier in this lecture. Marx embraces that distinction. They share the deduction of a labor theory of value from that distinction between exchange value and use value. So the idea that the basis of all value is labor is made necessary precisely by the fact that nothing else can explain how all these different things can exchange in a marketplace through the medium of money. They share a recognition that value in capitalism, and therefore wage labor itself, is an abstraction. Which is to say, and I've just got a question about this at the break, I said Smith calls value an abstraction. How can that be? Think about it this way. 100 different people doing 100 different things. How would you compare what they're doing, their different activities? How could you imagine that they are somehow equivalent? The simple fact that they exchange their goods in a market in terms of prices indicates that there is something common to all of their products, and therefore to all of their activities, however different they may appear when you actually look at them. You must therefore abstract from the particular things that they do and the particular goods that they produce, their use values, and understand them as having in common this abstract thing of labor. Labor that is independent of the particular things that they produce. Now, does that make sense? It's not a simple concept. I better not take questions right now about it because we might never get past it. So I'll move on. Marx and Smith also share a recognition that price and value may diverge. Marx believes that value is ultimately what matters in understanding capitalism. And it's interesting that Smith shared that view. And in many ways, the difference between political economy as a field of inquiry and economics as it is pursued today and understood today is precisely this issue. Economics as it is pursued today and has been pursued for a century or more basically has given up thinking about value. It is not interested in value. It is interested in price. And there's good reason for that insofar as it's a whole lot easier to work with prices. You actually have them. They speak themselves to you. They give you numbers. You can talk about them, analyze them, statistically manipulate them. They're right there in front of your face. The fact that price and value may diverge and that value may not be somehow tractable through price for economists today makes value intractable and to that extent unstudyable. And it's interesting that economics descends from the writings of people like Smith, who actually said, no, value is what explains the system. Value is what really ultimately matters, even if it's something that can't be read from price.
Could you argue that value is measured in utility?
Could you argue that value is measured in utility? Yes, and to the extent that economics has an explanation or a definition of value, it is, yes, it will turn to utility. And it will say, the value of good is how much good it is for somebody. Note the circularity. And then they will carry on talking about price. They'll say, oh, well, what somebody's going to pay is the price expression of their valuation of what is useful, its utility to them, right? Marx and Smith share an understanding of the division of society into laborers, capitalists, and landlords who reap wages, profits, and rents, respectively. And they share a recognition that this is historically novel, that this way of dividing up society in its productive relations is relatively new at the time that Smith and Marx wrote. So, a couple of the readings that I asked you to do are from this discussion that Marx has in Capital about the relationship of large-scale industry to agriculture. And this is where he unavoidably is going to intersect the kinds of issues that Malthus was interested in, right? He says, in the sphere of agriculture, large-scale industry annihilates the bulwark of the old society, the peasant, and substitutes for him the wage laborer. It is industry, which you think of as being located in the cities, which reconstitutes the relationships of the workers to the soil. And I mentioned previously that the enclosure acts in Britain, in many places, in much of Britain, were about previously feudal land tilled by peasants being turned into pasture land for sheep. And that the reason this was happening is that wool prices were high because there were factories in the cities that were making textiles from wool. And the landowners decided they could make more profit raising sheep and shearing them for the wool and selling it to the factory owners in the cities than they could from having peasants there growing food. And what Marx is going to focus on here is the fact that those peasants, what do they do next? They got to go somewhere, right? If they're not going to be able to make a living growing crops on these feudal estates, where are they going to go? They're going to go to the cities and become potential wage laborers in those factories. And here again, we can think about Smith, who suggests that this division into three classes is a kind of ongoing cycle of incremental conversion of the activities of peasants into wage laborers, the relative growth of industry in cities replacing the dominance of agriculture in the countryside, right? Now, in many ways, what Marx is going to do is going to take that diagram I gave you, that circular pattern that Smith describes, in which population can lower wages and increase profits and investments and create this kind of ongoing self-correcting loop. Marx is going to stop and say, well, wait a minute. It's not some kind of nice, clean, happy, self-correcting loop. He's going to say, no, it's the fact that those factory owners control these jobs and these factories that creates the class of people who have no jobs. So far from self-correcting, it is in fact self-creating as a problem rather than self-correcting to make a solution. But that's the end of the lecture. I'm trying to anticipate it because I know I'm not going to get there. Capitalist production collects the population together in great centers, cities, and causes the urban population to achieve an ever-growing preponderance. This has two results. On the one hand, it concentrates the historical motive power of society. So the growth of industry in the cities causes a demographic shift from countryside, predominantly rural society, to cities, predominantly urban society. And he suggests this concentrates the historical motive power of society. That is, people, suddenly they're living together in dense populations rather than spread out and diffuse or thinly dispersed across larger areas. And he notices that this has really pronounced effects on the kinds of things that a society can do. It's not just the division of labor, the creation of all kinds of interesting trades and specializations, and this elaborate system of production. He also observes that it creates the conditions in which you can have large-scale urban uprisings, right? You can have workers who, because they see each other every day and are closely packed into slums, poor neighborhoods, factories, can actually decide that something's wrong and they're going to do something about it. That's part of the historical motive power of society for Marx. On the other hand, it disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth, i.e., it prevents the return to the soil of its constituent elements consumed by man in the form of food and clothing. Hence, it hinders the operation of the eternal natural condition for the lasting fertility of the soil. What is he talking about? Any idea? Yeah? Okay, you take the food and fiber that are produced in the countryside, and you transport them to the city to feed and clothe the people who are concentrated there. Then what happens? Pardon? Well, whatever happens, that food and those clothes don't end up back on the farm where they were grown, right? Yeah.
It seems like falls in line with what he's trying to describe here.
Okay. All right. Yes. Geographical displacement of resources from their point of production to their point of consumption. But he's actually talking about something very much more concrete, so to speak, the lasting fertility of the soil. What is he talking about?
The demand for consumption can't outstrip the ability to produce because the consumers no longer doing the regulations through that way.
Get more precise. Describe what you're actually talking about.
Like maybe before it was subsistence living, so like small families had small farms that provide for themselves, but now you're concentrating a lot of food in one area for a large population. So it can't be like a small farm. Then, like, it's like
It can't be a small farm, but how do small farms take care of the lasting fertility of the soil? Yeah. Compost. Shit. Okay? I kid you not. We're talking about the nutrients that are coming out of the soil in one place and taking the form of food or fiber and then moving over here to a city where they are consumed and there is waste from that consumption. Those nutrients pass through people and they go somewhere. They don't go back to the farm, right? He's literally talking about the cycling of nutrients and organic material through production and consumption and disposal. He's literally talking about the fact that previously the food was consumed, and we can talk about animal food as well as human food, close to or reasonably close to where it was produced in the first place. And the manure and the waste, including human waste, was, as a normal practice, returned to the fields where the food and fiber was grown. And part of why he's concerned about this is that the Thames River in London was a cesspool, right? The urban solution was to create sewer systems and run tons of water through the houses and latrines of a city and flush it all into the Thames. And all the nutrients end up in the Thames and flow out towards the North Sea, right? He's also talking about the fact that at the very same time this was happening, there was a kind of global competition going on between the great powers of Europe, the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British and the Dutch, for birdshit. Guano. There was skirmishes in this great struggle between the world's leading naval and maritime powers, right, commercial powers, over small islands in various parts of the ocean. Some of them, literally just a matter of acres in size. And they were busily claiming them because some of them had many meters thick of accumulated birdshit, which was, for a time, the best, cheapest available supply of fertilizer for farms in Europe. And they were literally landing on these islands, scraping the birdshit off of them, putting it on boats, and sending it back to Europe so that it could be distributed on the crops, the fields of Europe. Why? Because this metabolic interaction had been displaced, right, had been interrupted. And the sort of local source of nutrients, manure for fertilizer, was no longer where it needed to be to work as fertilizer. And Marx found this completely insane, or at least deeply irrational. That at the same time that they were flushing all of these nutrients into the Thames where they became a cesspool and completely disgusting to everybody anywhere near, they were also shipping in birdshit from literally around the world to restore the fertility of the fields from which those nutrients had come. And this struck him as absurd, or perhaps better just as a marvelous illustration of how irrational this market system had become, or could be. And yes, you can think about this in terms of Darwin's nightmare and think about how odd it is that the nutrients from this lake get distributed in the ways that they do after the fish are caught, right? The fillets end up in Europe and the bones and the heads end up feeding the local population. Anyway. So, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the worker but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more long-lasting sources of that fertility. The more a country proceeds from large-scale industry as the background of its development, as in the case of the United States, the more rapid is this process of destruction. Capitalist production therefore only develops the techniques and the degree of combination of the social process of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. And that's from the closing paragraph of the first selection I asked you to read. Well, let's talk about this last slide. This will be the last slide. So, the law of diminishing returns. And here, again, we're going to contrast Malthus with Marx. The idea here is that agriculture expands, production per unit of land declines. For Malthus, this was explicable in terms of the supply of quality arable land, of fertile soil, right? The more you expand agriculture, the more you have to go from the better quality soils into lesser and lesser quality soils, simply because you've already used all the highest quality ones, right? And therefore, he suggests that chances are that as agriculture expands, you're going to get less and less of a return for every unit you invest in it. So for Malthus, it's about a finite supply of land and a fixed quality of land. For Ricardo explained this economically, and David Ricardo, by the way, is another political economist who lived in between Smith and Marx, and who, in terms of establishing what we think of as economics today, is probably more influential than either of them. One of his concepts was the idea of a fixed resource. And by fixed resource, he basically meant a resource for which you will experience this law of diminishing returns. The idea of diminishing marginal return, meaning that you can put more and more and more labor and capital into some kind of activity, but you will see diminishing returns per unit of investment. And he believed that this was simply the case for land. Land was his paradigmatic fixed resource. Marx has a very different take on this, and he's here relying on the work of a German chemist by the name of Justus Liebig, who very famously, probably the most famous soil scientist or early soil scientist in the world. Liebig pointed out that the fertility of the soil is not fixed. The fertility of the soil is actually a product of how people use it and manage it. And for Marx, this is a very important insight. In other words, the law of diminishing returns may or may not apply depending on the practices of farming. And the broken metabolic relationship just mentioned is a prime example of this, right? So if you see declining returns in agriculture, it may just be that agriculture itself should be practiced differently, not that you're up against some kind of natural limit. All right, we'll pick up the rest of this on Thursday. Thank you.